What's up, everybody? Welcome back to episode 6 of The Unqualified Engineer. I am Jackson Gabbard, as always, and I am videoing to you from the bedroom of my new flat in Dalston. Pretty hip area. I think I need to get some skinnier jeans to fit in here with the hipsters and their tattoos. So anyway, it's been a while since I've done a video, and that is because I have been moving and also spending my time crying my eyes out over Brexit, which I'm sure you all are as well. Life goes on. So far, we've only talked about coding problems. And coding problems are a major part of coding interviews, no doubt. They're super important. If you don't pass the coding interviews, you don't get the job. But they're not the only kind of interview you have to square off against in order to make it into one of these awesome companies that you want to work for. A viewer, Vahid Noor Mofidi, has pointed out that we have not talked about systems design interviews, architecture interviews, and that's absolutely true. And I think it's time to talk about them because they are, I would say, probably the second most important type of interview for you to be able to perform well in order to get the job that you want. And we'll go into why that's true. While we've talked about coding skills a lot, the reality is coding skills are only required to get you into the door. They're only required to get you sort of over the bar that is expected for engineers at the company that you're interviewing at. And in all honesty, coding interviews are pass-fail. It's very, very rare to see someone say, oh, their code was good, but not quite as good as it would take to pass the interview. Instead, it's kind of like they met my bar or they did not meet my bar. So in that way, it's a lot less interesting to prepare for because the gradient of performance is pretty constrained to either the people who can make it and the people who can't. So coding interviews are different from architecture interviews in exactly this way. Architecture interviews have a fantastic spectrum of competence, of speciality, of breadth, of depth. In an architecture interview, there really is actually no right answer. In fact, usually there's just a handful of good answers, and you sort of have to choose between them and make trade-offs and understand the complexities of the different things. And there's almost always a set of horrible answers, and we'll get into that a little bit. The reason this is important, though, the reason I'm bringing this up, this architecture interview, is, in fact, this is something most people don't talk about outside of really the set of people who interview at tech companies. The fact is, the architecture interview at most tech companies is the interview that determines what level of an offer you get. And what I mean by that is, if you go into an interview, and let's say you ace the coding interview, let's say you do perfectly fine on that, let's say the behavioral interviews are good, everyone wants to work with you, the question the company then has to ask themselves is, what level does this person sort of stack up against everyone else as? If we were going to put this person on the team, would they be the strongest technical contributor? Would they be the weakest? Would they be someone who can lead a team? Would they be someone who could lead many teams? Technically, that is. And so the architecture interview, in a lot of ways, is really a judge of how much technical leadership ability you have. And because of that, it relates directly to, literally how big of a number you get in your salary offer and how much equity you get in your sort of equity offer. The architecture interview determines this more than any other interview in the set. And maybe it's a good time to talk about the fact that Silicon Valley actually has a bunch of different kinds of interviews. There's the coding interview, there is the behavioral interview, sort of the background interview. There's also the architecture interview, which we're going to talk about today. There are other specialized interviews that are used for different types of people. For instance, if you're a technical specialist, often there will be an architecture interview that is just about the area of technical expertise you have that's really, really deep in that. So for instance, when I was at Facebook, we would do architecture and design interviews for Android and for iOS that was focused specifically on how deep someone's architectural understanding of those platforms was. Similarly, for very, very senior people, there's often a special kind of leadership interview that's different from your standard behavioral interview. It's much more about, are you an effective leader? How do you lead people? How do you mentor people? What's your sort of mechanism for communicating upwardly and downwardly and aroundwardly and all of that? So anyway, there's lots of different kinds of interviews. The most common kinds you're going to run into if you're interviewing for a job are coding, architecture, sort of background and behavioral interviews. That's about it. Outside of that, that's about it. The rest are very, very specialized. You're not likely to come across those willy-nilly unless you're a very senior person already. And so architectural interviews definitely assess your ability to be a technical leader. And we can even break that down further, because you could say that architectural interviews are all about determining how adept you are at taking apart big problems and breaking them down into very coherent component problems, or taking a big fuzzy problem and actually just making sense of what you're even trying to do in the first place is another way to think about it. And so they're very different to coding interviews. Coding interviews, you get handed a very clean, coherent, straightforward problem. Here, make the code do this. And architecture interviews don't work at all like that. Architecture interviews give you the opportunity to expose a set of broad skills and also expect you to be very detailed about what you describe. And so you might think, wait, broad and detailed, what the fuck? Like, how can you even be that? Like, how can you be both diverse and ranging and also in-depth? And maybe it's a little bit of an oxymoron, but I think the truth of this comes from the fact that there is no correct answer to the interview. There's no correct performance. So the performance you give in the interview really is about your ability to make progress through the problem with your own skill set, with your own understanding. In that way, I love architecture interviews. I love getting to use my brain and my skills and just see how much progress I can make through some random problem. You can even do this yourself as a thought experiment. If you think about a technology that you love, if you think about a service that you use, just try to imagine what sort of infrastructure it takes to enable that. I love the fact that my phone will automatically sync my photos to the cloud somewhere. And when I think about the infrastructure that's required for that, not just for me, but for the hundreds of millions of people who use the same service I use, that's a really interesting problem. Let's talk about the most common form of the architecture interview. This is the sort of interview you will find at any place that's assessing for kind of A-list talent. The interview will typically have this structure. You walk in, they explain that this is a different kind of interview, and you will be presented with a fuzzy problem that has a few important details that get given to you, and those details are super important, but there's very few of them. And then there will be some very specific constraints to satisfy. So, an example of this might be, this is a question I would have asked if I was still at Facebook. To somebody who has the right sort of background for it. I would never ask someone something completely outside of their background, but something that's maybe 1 degree away from what they know. So the question might be something like, assume that you have a very successful application. It's a mobile application on Android, on iOS, there's a mobile web app for it, so forth. Multiple platforms to support. And let's say you've got a user base of 500 million monthly active users, so a really, really active set of people who are using your services. Given that, build a logging infrastructure for your apps that makes it possible for your developers to log any arbitrary data from the app to the server that they want, that they need. So this could be any kind of log data, starting the app, stopping the app, switching features, messages sent and received, whatever. Basically build a tool set that lets the developers get the data off the device they need to make sense of and debug and performance test their application in production in a way that scales for all of the people who are using your app on all of the devices that are using it. So, that's the question. Now, is that daunting? Yeah, that's a daunting task. Is it fuzzy? Hell yeah, it's fuzzy. I've given you almost no details at all. Is it unfair, though? I'm sure there are some people watching it right now going, this is bullshit. There's no fucking way I could do that. That question is impossible. Now, I think it's worth pointing out that if you have a background in scale systems, high-scale systems, this is going to be an easier problem for you. It is. If you can't be at peace with that, then you're going to have a hard time. And in fact, what you should consider is, maybe you don't have a systems background. Maybe you haven't worked on 500 million monthly active user scale applications before. But you have a unique background. You have done stuff that likely other people haven't done. And so what this means is, you might come up with an answer to this problem. You might come up with a set of solutions and priorities that would be completely unique to you. And maybe the interviewer has never seen anyone try to solve the problem that way before. That's totally in your favor. If you can think coherently through the problem and deliver a solution that nobody else has seen before because you're coming at it from a different place, that's generally to your credit. That's generally going to work for you, as long as you covered the important bases of like, what are the fundamentals of the system? Have I missed anything major? That sort of thing. So you might give an amazing and unexpected answer that nobody else is going to give. For instance, maybe you have a mobile product background. You've helped build mobile products before. If I ask you this question, I would expect you to talk about things like battery consumption, cellular data consumption. I would expect you to think about the sort of on-device implications of a problem like this. So how much storage are you using? Will it interrupt the UI thread? How do you give the developers on the application a reasonable API for consuming and interacting with your logging infrastructure? Those are the things that I would expect you to think about. And I wouldn't expect you necessarily to answer the same way that like a distributed file systems person would. Someone like that, I would expect them to be saying things about how we're going to handle the writes at that scale. If you've got 500 million monthly active users, that's a lot of writes. Or maybe they would talk about the right way to converge all of these distributed written logs into a single log store and what that might look like, how they sort of carry around the data and bring it into a place where it's useful for somebody on the server side. And I wouldn't expect the distributed file systems engineer to know anything about the battery consumption of logging infrastructure or about the mobile networks versus Wi-Fi delivery of logs, right? Like, these interviews give you the opportunity to show your strength and your breadth. And you should totally play to your strengths. You should definitely nail the aspects of the problem that your background gives you a great leg up on. I think any interviewer would be expecting you to crush the aspect of the problem that is related to your own background. And maybe you have the background to be very balanced. Maybe you can address the server side of this pretty well, maybe you can address the client side of this pretty well, and maybe you can set both of those in the greater context of the problem trying to be solved. If that's you, that's awesome. Like, you have a crazy leg up, you're going to do well. However, if that's not you, and for most people, it's not. Most people don't have the background to do all of the problem in great detail. So my advice to you, if you're hearing a problem like this and thinking, shit, I can only solve part of that problem, my advice is, cool, solve as much of it as you can, and don't neglect the unfamiliar because it's unfamiliar. Don't run from the aspects of the problem that you don't immediately know how to solve. I would say address the parts you know well, briefly, like get in there, deliver coherent notions of what you would do here and there, how you would solve this and that, and then say, and the part of this that I am not so familiar with would probably be this aspect of it. Because an interview like this is trying to get exactly that signal. They want to know what your breadth and depth is. Where do the edges of your knowledge start? What's beyond the edge of your knowledge? What could they expect you to come in and do well? And so just by talking about the things you don't know, it doesn't mean that you're ruining your chances. It means that you're giving them great signal to figure out if you would be a successful contributing member of the team or not. So consider this also. If you are hung up on the fact that this doesn't play to your strengths, if you're hung up on the fact that you have no idea how to solve a problem like this, and you feel that it's unfair for someone to present this problem to you in such a way that makes you comparatively worse than someone who knows how to do this stuff well, you might want to factor in that if somebody else has the background to do this stuff well, they're going to be able to deliver more value for the company they join, probably. And that's not a slight against you. That's not a slight against your skill set. That's not a slight against anything about your background or abilities. All that's saying is, if you already know the ins and outs of high-scale systems, you're going to have an easier time getting up to speed and contributing meaningfully to a company that deals with high-scale systems. It's not as if it's supposed to be that every single person gets to walk in and prove themselves from the ground up on the same level. That's just not how life works. There are going to be some people who are better at the job than you. That, however, doesn't mean that you can't succeed in these interviews. You got to get yourself in the game. So please don't get scared. Don't get intimidated by how crazy these problems sound. Because as it turns out, they're actually a lot more reasonable than you think. And the math that it takes to make sense of that is actually not challenging. I've already talked a lot about how this kind of interview is all about breaking the problem down. So what do I mean by that? The easiest way to say this is just they're not going to give you enough information in the presentation of the problem to solve the problem. I've never seen an architecture interview where someone laid out in front of someone clearly every single detail they needed to solve the problem. At least not initially. Maybe if the person really struggled and could not make progress through the problem, the interviewer would start clarifying their own problem, would start giving people clearer details to make better progress through it. But that's not the point of the interview. The point of the interview is to give you something fuzzy that contains the details if you sort of process the problem. That's one way to think about it. If you take the details they give you and then interrogate those details to make them actually the information you need to solve the problem. Let me think of an example of this. So for instance, we just talked about designing a logging infrastructure for a 500 million monthly active user base application. So the first question you should be stumbling against here is, wait, 500 million monthly active users? What does that mean? Like, what do you... 500 million? 500 million is a big, scary number. Like, what do I do? That's sort of layer one of this problem. And it's intentional that it's presented this way, because a tech lead, someone who is responsible for taking apart big problems and helping other people be productive, they should be able to go, whoa, 500 million monthly actives, that's not a number we care about in terms of taking that number and turning it into hardware, in terms of how much scalability you need to solve the problem, what sort of network throughput. 500 million monthly active users is funny money. So if monthly active users is not the number you care about, what is the number you care about? Well, the short answer is, if you've got 500 million people per month, that's great. Good job, you, for building an amazing, successful platform. But if you're putting an application on hardware, if you're running it on servers, what you need to know is, what's the peak traffic? How much throughput is this thing going to need to handle in the worst case? So you might think, oh, okay, cool, got this 500 million users, a month, 30 days in a month, 86,400 seconds in a day, divide, boom, there's your number. If you did this, you'd be wrong, because that's not even remotely accurate to how actual applications get used in real systems. Why is that, you wonder? Well, it's because people don't live in perfect uniform geographic distribution around the world, nor do people each access their favorite applications perfectly randomized from every other person around them, such that it makes a smooth blend of people using applications. No, that's not how it works at all. It works in the sense that when you get home from work, you log on to Facebook and see what's going on there, and you and everybody in your entire town and city and state and country probably are doing the same thing at about the same time. So what this means is there are peaks and troughs in the traffic to any system of scale. Must be. So the question you have to ask here is like, well, what sort of user base are we planning for? And this is where your access to your interviewer matters a lot, and where your clarifying questions can win you major points towards like a positive outcome for the interview. So for instance, if someone says to me, 500 million monthly active users, the first thing I think is, are they geographically distributed? Like, are they around the world? Or is this only in the US and in Western Europe? Because each of those would give you different traffic patterns. And another thing would be, what sort of daily penetration does that give us? Do we assume that it's some large fraction? Like, why not? We could do that. Let's assume that, like, if we've got 500 million monthly actives, let's say that our application has roughly 70% of that who come back every single day. Maybe that's optimistic, but it's at least a number to hang on to. It's a point of reason to give you a formula to help solve the problem, and you can tweak those numbers as you need to. The important part is not if you get the number right. The important part is, have you made reasonable progress through the problem? Okay, so let's assume that we let's assume that we have 70% of the 500 million monthly actives who are active every day. So that gives us what, like 350 million-ish users every day. And let's assume that based on the geographic distribution of our users, that it's actually about 70% of that 70% that are active at peak hours. Why might this be the case? Well, maybe our user base is entirely in India, and because of that, everyone is, roughly geographically clustered together. Or maybe it's just the US and Western Europe, with a super hard concentration at the eastern part of the US. Or maybe it's a really popular application in China, and because of that, you get a big cluster of people who are all awake and available to use the internet casually at the same time of day. Whatever the reasoning, this is what you would sort of work out with the interviewer about the context you're in. let's just assert for ourselves, because this is me in my room by myself. So let's say we've got 500 million and we're taking 70% of that as a daily active, so 350, and then 350 million, that is. And then let's say we've got 70% of that is the peak hours set of users. So is that about 245 million, roughly? So 245 million is still a big, crazy number, though, right? Like, how do you turn that into a number that is reasonable? Well, what we've said just now, if we sort of interrogate our own language, or if I interrogate my own language, I won't speak as the royal we. I said we've got 245 million people in a given peak hour. So there's 60 minutes in an hour and 60 seconds in a minute. And I think if you do the math on that, that comes out to about, 245 million divided by 60, that is. I think that gives you about 68,000 concurrent users. Let me double check that. So 68,000 is a pretty tractable number. We're imagining that we've got 68,000 peak traffic active users. Now let's imagine we wrote our server as a typically poorly optimized JavaScript application in Node, and it supports only 1,000 people concurrently per server, per EC2 instance, or whatever we're running this thing on. So if we can support 1,000 people per server, and we've got 68,000 people at peak time, I think that means we need about 68 servers. So think about this. We've taken a problem from 500 million crazy people, super big numbers, can't even fathom it, don't even know what to do, down to, we can probably run this on 68 servers, in the horribly optimized case. That's pretty good progress. And it is the job of a tech lead to be able to make these kinds of capacity estimations, to be able to take a big fuzzy problem like that and turn it into some sort of reasonable, tractable level of complexity. And from there, you can make real progress. You can say, okay, what does this server need to do? What are the specific tasks it has to take on? But we'll get to that in a bit. Okay, I would like to take a moment to make a meta point about these interviews. If you're playing along at home, you may have just noticed that I just made up a bunch of fucking numbers. You might be saying, did you just make up a bunch of fucking numbers? And the answer is, yeah, I just made up a bunch of fucking numbers. Yes, that's okay. It is okay for me to make up these numbers, because an architecture interview is not an interview trying to determine how psychic you are. It's not an interview trying to determine if you can precisely predict the traffic volume and patterns of exactly the company that you're working for. And if you don't do that, you fail the interview. It's not that kind of challenge. What it is a challenge to see if you can handle this kind of complexity without getting lost, without getting caught up in the details and sort of ensnared in the little corners and edges of the problem. If you can make steady progress through a fuzzy problem with approximations that are like reasonable, right? Is my number definitely right? No, in fact, my number is definitely wrong. For one, because it's a made-up system, but even if there was a perfect system that already existed in the wild, what I just explained would not match it perfectly. Maybe it turns out you can support 5,000 people on a given server, and so in that case you need way fewer than 68,000 servers. So in that case you need way fewer than 68 servers. You would need, a fifth of that many, whatever that number is, 12. So again, this is not about being psychic. It is about being able to take a big thing and break it down reasonably into smaller things that you could actually make a real move on. If you were an engineer designing a system for 500 million people, and someone asked you, hey, we gotta buy servers for that. How many servers do you need? And you said, about 1 million, give or take. If you just ballparked it like that, at best, you're going to lead to the financial ruin of your company. Yeah, so having these skills, being able to break it down to something reasonable, even if you're wrong by double in either direction. If it's too few servers, then you've done okay because you can just buy more servers later. And if it's too many servers, then you're okay because your company is on a rocket ship and you're going to need that capacity soon anyway. So back to the problem. We've said that we have 70-ish thousand users on our system. Now, we could say, okay, cool, we can declare some number of machines, and then we can talk about basically what these things are going to do and move on, but that's not the challenge of this interview. The challenge of this interview is to refine and refine and refine, to just go as broad and as deep as possible. And so having a really clear idea of how many people you're building something for is really important. And it's a good indicator of your ability to be successful in the actual role that you would be filling where you would need these skills. So let's talk about users. What does 70,000 users mean? Total throughput? What's the total throughput of 70,000 users? Well, we don't know, right? Like, we have no idea. And you might still be thinking, oh, this is impossible to know. How can you possibly know what 70,000 people are going to need logged, whatever that means, to the server? If you feel that way, then you either are not thinking critically, or you don't have enough context on how mobile works, like what the mobile environment is like. This one is better than this one. So let's find some real-world boundaries here. For instance, if we've got 70,000 people who are using mobile devices, could they possibly be sending us 5 megs per second each? The answer to that is no. Like, I don't know anybody who would be willing to pay for the bandwidth for some application streaming 5 megs per second to the server constantly, just as the background logging service. Like, maybe if you're using Facebook Live video, you would want to be streaming that much data. But most people would not want Facebook to be using, or Google to be using, or Dropbox, or whoever to be using 5 megs per second of background data just for logging, for metadata, right? Like, they would be upset with you. So that's one way to frame it. Like, what's the actual maximum that you could possibly put through someone's phone without them being like, your app is abusing my network, I hate you? Another way to think about it is, what can people possibly do on their phone to generate logs? They can start and stop the app, they can switch tabs, they can send messages, they can load pictures. But even still, there's an upper bound of actions per minute that people could possibly do, right? Like, let's say you could send 30 or 40 messages per minute maximum if you're typing furiously. Maybe you could receive a few dozen photos, realistically, if someone is sending them to you, realistically. And with this, we can refine a sort of an upper bound or an expectable average number of logs that are coming from the devices in the first place. A novice might just say, okay, cool, well, it's half a meg. That's probably be half a megabyte of data. And I bet there's some of you watching this video right now going, yeah, half a meg sounds about right. Yeah. So that's rookie level. No offense. The better level would be to say, okay, let's do some real estimation. If we've got, let's say we're going to log 100 actions per minute, what would the actual logs look like? How many integers? How many strings? How much arbitrary data would you allow to be packaged in? And then see what that number grinds out to if you multiply it by the 100 or so actions per minute. That's not a good answer, though. In fact, the best answer is not an answer that sort of looks at the data. It's an answer that asserts what is reasonable. This is where leadership comes in. So let's say I'm designing the system for a team of engineers. I gotta be thinking about my users. I gotta be thinking about the people who are generously giving me their bandwidth to help make my product better in the hope that it's actually better for them at all, ever, in any way. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. If I'm empathetic to them, if I give a shit about them, I should be saying, ho, 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 ho. How much bandwidth do we have to take up in order to get the minimal signal that we need to make the product better? And I think you can make really, really reasonable maximums about this just by reasoning about what people would feel comfortable with. For instance, if we go back to the half a meg per minute number, if you do half a meg per minute, if there's 60 minutes in an hour, and let's say people tend to use the app for an hour, that's 30 megs of data. Megabytes of data are expensive, and megabytes of data are time-consuming. If you're a user in India and you have a shitty internet connection, or if you're in Africa and you have the worst internet connection in the world, so much that we have to fly drones in the air and beam internet down to you, 30 megs of data will make you cry. Like that, that could be your entire month's worth of food and water and shit. So you don't want to do that. So be empathetic. Make a decision, like make an assertion that is empathetic to the people who are using your platform. Don't use 500K of their data every minute. Maybe use 10, 15, 20K. Like, choose a maximum that would be a reasonable ratio to the amount of traffic they're actually serving on your platform, and make that the upper bound. Design your system around that, because just because you can log more data doesn't mean you should. And if you are thinking about the product not just from a technical standpoint, but from well, how does this fit into the whole picture standpoint? You're going to perform more strongly in the interview. The interviewer is going to go, holy shit, this person is keeping the bigger picture in mind. They're not just in the weeds technical. They can think about what the actual consumer impact is of their decisions, which matters a lot. Once you've arrived at this point, you know basically like kind of how many people you're going to serve and what the sort of traffic you need to serve is. You can start defining what the API might look like between the servers. And in fact, we have only scratched the surface of this problem, and we've been going for 10 or so minutes now at least. We've done a decent job of capacity estimation, and we've done a decent job of sort of breaking down what the peak traffic will look like for us and what we need to plan for in that way. But that's just the beginning. That's just the foundation of the actual technology discussion you need to have. We haven't talked about client-side implementation across different platforms, how we're going to handle iOS and Android and, WebOS. Nobody uses WebOS. Windows Phone. We haven't talked about smart televisions. We haven't talked about Apple TV implementations or Chromecast applications, which you wouldn't write because the API is terrible. About the server-side implementation at all. We haven't talked about what is the server side of this application going to look like? What's it going to behave like? What are the components of it? What technologies are we going to use to achieve it? How are we going to update it? We haven't talked about the network traffic of the logs. We haven't talked about if they're going to be compressed, if they're going to be encrypted. We haven't talked about what sort of protocol we want to use to speak between the client and the server. Many things. We haven't talked about whether or not we would deliver logs only on Wi-Fi in case they're big or across the mobile network where we know the person is paying for it. And talked about long-term storage of all of these logs. Imagine 500 million people worth of logs. Where do you store them? How much of those logs do you need? Do you need full access to the last 3 days and then fall off access to the last 7 days and fall off access to the last 30 days before that? Allow resolution to deteriorate over time because the recency is really what matters? Oh man, we haven't talked about how many people it takes to build a system like this. We haven't talked about how long it takes to build a system like this. We haven't talked about how much a system like this would cost to build. We haven't talked about the operational cost of keeping the system up and running. We haven't talked about how you would access these logs as a person developing the app and make use of them. Okay.
We haven't talked about different ways to get access to the log data on the server side. Are we going to go Hadoop, Hive? Are we going to go with sort of a distributed SQL type interface? I don't know. That's something we would need to talk about. We haven't talked about retention of log data. We haven't talked about user privacy. Are we logging private data in the logs? If so, are we deleting those logs whenever the user says delete my data? Do we even have a delete my data plan in our application? These are important details.
It's okay, we get it. There's a lot. And so the challenge of the interview in part is covering this breadth. Really, really being able to see what are all of the key factors of decisions around systems like this? What are the most important things you actually need to address to deliver a real system like this? Your challenge in an interview like this, your challenge in an architecture interview is to keep going. Keep going. Someone once said that Winston Churchill once said that if you're going through hell, keep going. That's a lot like an architecture interview. Don't give up. Don't flag. Don't stop and go, I don't really know what to do next. If at any point you say to yourself, I don't really know what to do next, it's a sign that you either are not actively engaging enough in the interview, or that you're not familiar enough with the problem. And in either case, you got to motivate yourself. You got to get your ass in gear and keep going. And maybe that means you look to the interviewer and say, okay, let me take stock of where I am. You run through what you know already. Talk with them, engage with them, try to help them help you move forward. If you're completely stuck, you can say, hey, look, I'm really stuck. Can you give me a tip? It's much better to get unstuck and keep going, even if you have to take a hint, than to just sit there spinning your wheels. I mean, it's a trade-off, right? Because anytime you ask for help, you are definitely weakening your score, so to speak. You're weakening your outcome in the interview. But taking a hit like that and then recovering strongly and finishing strongly will matter way more, will benefit you way more than stalling out for 5 minutes and standing there silently in front of a whiteboard. It just will. So don't be afraid to take a hint if you're actually stuck. But definitely see it as your duty, your obligation, and your responsibility to keep driving the interview forward. You are in the driver's seat. You should treat it like a tech talk where you're explaining to the other person how the system is going to work. So don't look to them to tell you how to do it. You're the person who's supposed to be telling them how you're going to do it. So one more thing I want to say about this is your domain, your area of expertise matters, but it's not unfair to be presented a problem that's not in your domain, because these problems are not how well can you perfectly solve exactly the problem that we need to solve. These problems are how well can you apply everything you know to holistic problem solving, to taking a big fuzzy thing and breaking it down into little parts. For instance, I've never really worked deep in the weeds of massive scale image processing. I don't know anything about that. I know it exists. I have a sense of like how bigger scale-ish systems works. So if you ask me a question about image processing, I could take 45 minutes and think through as much of it as I possibly could, no question. And that's not because I'm amazing and I know everything about it. It's just because like I'm not scared to grind through a problem where I'm unfamiliar with pieces of it. So just remember, they're looking for technical leadership. So if you throw your hands up and say, I don't understand how this problem works, I can't possibly do this, it's not my specialty, that is clear signal that you are not a strong technical leader. On the other hand, if you come in and say, I don't really know this piece, but I've read a thing about this, and I'm pretty sure a system like that would have to have these components because of the thing I worked on one time, and then you start to refine the other pieces and how it all fits together, then you stand a pretty good chance. That's leadership. That's saying, this problem is tractable. I will make as much progress as I possibly can. Don't back down from the problem. So let's talk about failing. You might fail this interview. It's a tough interview. Like it's a formidable interview that has a lot of ambiguity to it. And for a lot of people who are used to being able to crush coding interviews, to be really, really strong at solving a specific problem to 100%, these interviews are going to be daunting. These interviews are going to be a different animal than what you're used to. But you should factor in a few things. For one, failing an architecture interview doesn't mean it's the end of the road for you. It doesn't mean that you're done. In fact, companies like Facebook, they don't even give architecture interviews to new graduates, to people with very little industry experience, because they just know this person is not possibly going to do well at this. They don't have enough context on how these systems work. It's not taught in school. So if you're a year or two into your first job, and you don't have a ton of experience in building large-scale systems, like, it's not the end of the world. You're not going to be slammed utterly if you just don't do a great job. Get in there, get your hands dirty, like make as much progress as you can possibly make. And at the end of the interview process, they'll say, you know, she didn't like nail the design interview, but her coding was super strong and it's obvious she's got a ton of passion. Like, we definitely want to work with her. If you contrast that against somebody who like comes in and says, ugh, I can't do this, I don't know how this stuff works. You know, that interview feedback might be like, yeah, like he crushed the coding interviews, but he didn't even engage at all with the architecture problem. We just don't have any signal there. It's hard to know. And that also tells us that whenever he's faced with a problem he can't solve, he gives up. So just get in there, just go for it. Make as much sense of it as you possibly can, and assume that failing it isn't the end of the road. Now, there's the other case here. I'll give you a story from my experience as an interviewer at Facebook. At one point, we interviewed a candidate, and everybody loved him. He was awesome. Like, I still think of the guy as like, man, I learned things in that interview. Dude was cool. So in the coding interview, he was awesome. In the second coding interview, he was awesome. In the behavioral, like background interview, he was super cool. Everyone thought, yeah, man, let's hire this guy. Now his architecture interview was weak. And it wasn't weak as in like he didn't sort of know enough stuff. It was like weak in the sense of like, how well did he engage with the problem? How much did he guide the conversation? The interviewer like sort of stepped back up and thought, I really had to keep pushing this guy forward. He kept going, okay, and then what? But it should be the other way around. It shouldn't be the candidate asking the interviewer, and then what? It should be, if at all, the other way around. The interviewer saying, oh, okay, cool, what's next? And moving the thing forward. So that's not this guy. He's looking to be led. Now you would think, okay, well, sure, but like he didn't stall out completely. He did okay. And so we chose to hire him. We said, yes, let's hire this person. And we brought him in for what we call candidate review. We brought him in to like be assessed by higher level people to make sure we're making consistent, good hiring decisions. And that's done by a director. And so the director read over the feedback from the interviews and said, we can't hire this person. And I was like, what? Like, what do you mean? No, like, we all decided we're going to hire him. And the director was like, look, this candidate has 8 years of industry experience. 8 years. And after 8 years, their architecture mindset is, I don't know, what's next? That's not somebody we want here. That's not somebody who can be successful here. And when I stepped back, I was like, shit, man, that's kind of right. Like, there's the famous Bob Dylan line, you're either busy living or you're busy dying, right? I think Facebook and most A-list tech companies kind of live by this philosophy that you're either progressing to a really high level of technical competence or you're kind of toast. So at Facebook, for instance, there is a bar you have to reach. And I know this is true at Google, definitely true at other tech companies. That you have to reach a certain level of technical competence. You have to reach a certain engineering level. And if you don't reach that level in a certain amount of time, it's goodbye. Like, they move on. They free you up for other employment opportunities. Now, it takes a while. This is like something that should happen along the line of like 3 or 4 years. But if you don't make it to that bar in that amount of time, you don't get to work at that company anymore. And so we looked at this candidate and said, well, he's got 8 years of experience. In 8 years, this guy hasn't gotten to the level of technical skill, the level of architectural sort of confidence that we need. Now, you could say, hey, he just didn't work for the right companies. And that would be true easily if he had only worked for one company or another company and only maybe for a couple of years. You could give him that benefit. You could give him that benefit of the doubt. But if you're talking about 8 years, if in 8 years he himself hasn't expected more of himself, it's extremely unlikely that he would be successful at a company that demands as much as a company like Facebook or Google or Apple or insert A-list tech company here. So think about that in your own career. Are you pushing yourself? And have you been complacent? If you've been complacent in your role for a while, you have massively hurt your own chances of getting hired at a better company. So, don't delay. Get off your ass. Get into these interviews. Give yourself the opportunity to push yourself forward. Don't sit back on your laurels, because that breeds complacency. That breeds the busy dying category of the get busy or living or get busy dying dichotomy. Okay, now that I have blammed you with that bit of negative reinforcement, I think it's time to make some final points and leave you with some proper positive motivation. It's worth remembering that these interviews, no matter what level you are, no matter how far into your career you are, no matter how adept you are at this, these interviews are designed to find your edges and boundaries. So when you walk in, if the interviewer is doing their job correctly, you're going to feel like, holy crap, I had to dig deep to make it through that interview. That's the correct state. That means the interview went well. And in exactly that same way, these are open-ended interviews. There's no correct final state. There's no correct amount of content to get through or the correct amount of depth to get into. It's all about trade-offs. It's all about whether or not you communicate enough with the interviewer to make sure they know what you're capable of. And remember, these problems are impossible to solve. You cannot solve them fully. I don't even know what that would mean. They're not designed at all to be solved in 45 minutes, which is about the amount of time you would normally have. It's just about getting through as much as you can get through and delivering as much detail about what you're capable of, how you think about problems, what's the breadth and depth that you can evaluate in real time on a brand new problem. That's what it's all about. So, if it sounds stressful, if it sounds like a lot, like, yes, it is, and by design, come to peace with that. Come to peace with the fact that you will never finish one of these interviews feeling like you touched on everything you wanted to touch on. In fact, if you did, it means probably that the problem was too easy, if anything. Now, for the people who are at home right now, thinking, my company doesn't do anything like this, I never get exposure to these kinds of problems, I have no chance at this. There's some truth to that. Like, if you're not surrounded by these kinds of problems, and these kinds of people solving these kinds of problems, your ability to come up against these problems and prevail is less. You will not be as good at solving these kinds of problems as people who are surrounded by it all day, every day. But that's not to say that you don't have a chance. The thing to keep in mind that people who are inside of tech companies know, that people who are outside of tech companies wouldn't know, is that most people who work in tech companies don't solve massive scale architectural problems all day, every day. In fact, the people who are solving those problems typically have one big win, if you want to call it that, one big delivery along those lines, like maybe every 6 months or a year. And what's interesting about this is that inside of tech companies, when people do achieve some great architectural thing, when they solve some problem really well, they talk about it. They talk about it to everybody. They give tech talks. They give presentations. They type up really, really detailed internal communications to tell people, hey, here's what we've done. Here are the things that it solves now. Here is the new system we have and how we would love for you to use it. They promote their systems internally. So what that means is that if you're inside of a tech company already, you get access to a fantastic amount of detail about exactly these kinds of systems, just because people who are building them want you to use them. So keep that in mind. Like maybe that sounds like, oh no, I don't have that. Now I'm double screwed. You could look at it that way. Or what you could say is, oh, actually, a lot of the people who are good at this aren't good at this because they've done it all day, every day as part of their job. They're good at it because they're in the environment of that. And then you could think, can I be in the environment of that? Can I do this sort of thing? Can I be exposed to that kind of stuff? And the answer is yes. In fact, the answer is hell yes, you can. Tech companies, smart companies that are trying to hire awesome people, they are not bounded by their ability to talk about their cool stuff to the world. They're bounded by how many awesome people they can find who are passionate about these kinds of problems. And so they do plenty of the former in order to make more and find more of the latter. Or to put that more simply, tech companies talk publicly about their awesome contributions to the tech world, to the architecture world, to the crazy systems world. They talk about them constantly. Every engineering blog for every tech company that I know is filled with discussions of exactly these kinds of systems. So this gives you a leg up. This means that you can treat all of those engineering blog posts and YouTube videos and conference talks, treat those as your sort of community talking about big scale systems. We inside of tech companies have that. People outside of tech companies don't have that, but the same people are talking about the same things just in different forms. And I have some friends who would say things like, I don't know, it just feels weird to stalk all of Facebook's engineering blog posts just to get ready for the interview. But that's not really what you're doing. What you're doing is exposing yourself to the context of the company that you want to join. If you are crazy about what Tesla is up to, go and read every single thing on all of their engineering blogs. Do that. Because then when you go there, you have a leg up. You understand their systems, and that doesn't mean that you're cheating to win at the interview. No, you're basically just getting ready for the job early. Because those same pieces of knowledge and context, they don't just matter in the interview. They matter once you get into the company, when you get hired. So it's not cheating. You're not breaking the rules. If the companies didn't want you to know this stuff, they wouldn't be talking about it publicly. So take advantage of that. Hit the blogs, the YouTube videos from conference talks. Read the super in-depth, charts and graphs that are published about open data centers and about, basically every single piece of technology that these companies are talking about publicly. The more of that you get your head around, the more tools you will have in your arsenal to tackle architectural problems. The people I know who are the best at large-scale systems. For instance, I'm friends with one of the people who came up with the Haystack file system. He wrote the white paper on it. You know what his favorite activity is? What he organized groups of other engineers to do? Read white papers. They would get together at lunch and just read documents, read people talking about the crazy shit they're trying to build. He has a deep passion for it. He's also a fantastically good engineer, but that's what he does. He's not cheating. He's learning. My final point here, which I hope is purely positive, is that the tech industry will greedily and happily and eagerly hire every single person they can who has enough passion for this domain to be awesome at it. It doesn't matter what your pedigree is. It doesn't matter if you're a Harvard or an MIT or a Stanford graduate, or if you studied at the University of DeVry online. It doesn't matter. Maybe you're like me and you have a degree in English from a school that's really famous only for being named after the governor of Tennessee who opposed teaching evolution in schools. The pedigree you have matters less than what you can do on the job. And all you have to do to get the job is just find opportunities to put yourself in the critical path of those jobs. Don't be scared to. Don't feel like, oh no, the sense of rejection is going to be so daunting, I can't take it. Get ready for some rejection. For instance, I applied to Google before I joined Facebook, and Google rejected me. Burn. Not interested. Whoops, life goes on. Later on, I applied to Facebook. Facebook hired me. And around my third year at Facebook, Google recruiters were calling me or sending me cold messages to my email saying, hey, Google's looking for some crazy people to work on some front-end stuff, which I think was probably Google Plus at the time. Don't think of rejection as shutting the door. Think of rejection as you're getting closer. If you get rejected, it means you were at least at the front door of that place. Just keep going.